Hi, everyone. Good evening. Let me put on my glasses. It is Tuesday, April 16th. It's a regular meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. We reserve 10 minutes at the beginning for public comment. Can you not hear me? Okay, there you go. Reserve 10 minutes at the beginning of this meeting for public comment. I only have one green sheet at this point. Okay, come on up. It's all right. You don't have to run. Sorry. Okay, is there anybody else? You don't have to run? No? Okay, so I've got two. So the public may comment in any matter except for items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record is already closed. So looks like they're both clear and objective, so that's not an issue. We do have the city attorney here, so they'll let you know if there's any challenges, but I doubt it. The time limit is generally 3 minutes. Since there's only two people, come on up and we'll, if you're taking a lot more than, if you're verging outside of 10 minutes, we're gonna regulate you a little bit. So I have first Ed McMahon, and if you could come up, actually Ed, you can be the example, address, name,
Good evening, Commissioners. Ed McMahon, Executive Director of the Home Builders Association, 1065 River Road. My thoughts aren't organized tonight, but I felt like I needed to be here because I feel like I'm close to going back to three of my associates and saying, okay, you were right, I'm wrong, I concede. Because those three associates told me at the beginning of the clear and objective cleanup that I was wasting my time, that it would never be done on the local level. Why are you even going to invest your time doing this? I disagreed. The city made a commitment to do this. Staff was dedicated to do it, and I saw a lot of positive action going on, and I was optimistic about something happening. The work group got together. We made excellent progress. After the work group, I still felt like things were on track. Something's actually going to happen. And since then, I believe staff has found themselves between a rock and a hard spot because there's been a lot of other activity and opposition to what's going on coming from groups that didn't really participate in the plan. And it appears to me that even though a lot of progress has been made, 20% slope, 30% setback, a lot of great things have happened, other things are starting to happen that takes us back to what it is now, to the point to where you're forced into the discretionary track. And I believe the Planning Commission has an opportunity to maybe turn the train around and get it back on the right track and influence council to do what's right. And I would encourage staff to go ahead and continue with your mission to clean up clear and objective standards. There is going to be opposition. Take it to the council. We'll have public hearings and we'll work it out then. But tonight, my main statement is, yeah, I'm beginning to believe that my other associates were correct, and the only way we've been able to clean up clear and objective standards in the past is with LUBA appeals. And it would appear that that may be the way we're going to have to do it in the future too. And I'd sure like to get it done right this time. And in closing, if there's so much opposition to a lot of these developments that we try to develop under either track, why in the heck is that land in the buildable land inventory in the first place? If it's in the BLI, it should be developed. That's it. Appreciate your work. Thanks for listening to my vent.
Thank you. The next person I have is John Webster. If you can just, your name and address, please.
Yeah, my name is John Webster. I'm our local architect here. My address is 1401 Quaker Street.
Great.
So I'm actually here to represent myself as an architect in the area, and I believe that it's important, the type of work that you guys are working on right now, to try and make it so that housing specifically in something that's near and dear to my heart is affordable housing is available for people. There are a number of issues that are still being worked out within the city council and things like that regarding some of the state objectives that have happened regarding specifically accessory dwelling units and the like. And I just want to, I guess, voice my support for work on that type of those types of projects. I think it's important to be able to fill in missing middle portions of the city that have availability for development and to make it clear and easy for people to be able to do that. I know that there is a lot of pushback from various communities, especially neighborhood communities, and I think it's important for them to to have their voice in it as well, but, to be able to have the professionals be able to provide educated voices towards those types of developments, I think are really important for as part of the conversation. So I guess I just wanted to come and voice my support specifically for that.
Perfect. Thank you.
I think that's it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, the next item we have, thank you for coming and participating. The next agenda item is we have agenda item B, work session. Primarily our entire meeting is really reserved for this. We'll reserve some time at the end for items for commission and staff. And can you guys give me a sense of who has items from commission? Just raise your hands. Okay, so not lots of time. Okay. Okay, perfect. So it's clear and objective update, and Janessa staff is here. We have Lauren, city attorney, and Alyssa Hansen, and Robin Hostek, and Janessa Dragovich. So anyways, Janessa's going to lead us similar to the other parts of the process. I'm going to let her go through the AIS and kind of step through how we're going to approach tonight.
Thank you, Kristen, or Commissioner Taylor.
That's all right. I know. I started informal too, and I was like, oh no, wait a minute, tighten it up. And
Yes, so I'm Janessa Dragovich. For those viewing at home that may not know me, I'm the project manager for the Clear and Objective Housing Approval Criteria Update. And tonight we're here to go over Batch 2 draft amendments for the Clear and Objective Update project. So before we do that, we'll do a quick project refresher. So state law requires that we have clear and objective standards for land use application types that involve housing. So for us, that means land divisions, planned unit developments, or I'll call them PUDs a lot, conditional uses, I may refer to those as CUPs, and site reviews. The goal of the Clear and Objective project is pretty simple. It's to improve efficiency and effectiveness in our Clear and Objective process. We do already have the Clear and Objective tracks for the land use application types that we are required to have them for. We can achieve our goals through changes that mitigate barriers to housing, increase efficiency and predictability, and effectively address development impacts. Improving predictability for applicants and ensuring neighborhood compatibility are not mutually exclusive goals. Throughout this project, we've taken an and both approach, and that's something that we're looking for guidance from you on how to find that balance. We're looking to remove the barriers, improve efficiency, and address compatibility. The best outcome for the community would be for us to adopt changes that both improve predictability and compatibility. The project was intentionally designed to allow an incremental review. This phase diagram I've shown you several times, so it should look pretty familiar. We're now in phase 3, the draft code writing phase. So we are going to walk through the proposed amendments to implement Batch 2 recommendations tonight and next Tuesday. So we have 2 full work sessions dedicated to get through this. I know it's a lot of code. We plan to bring the recommended proposed code changes for both batches to council in May. We're currently tentatively scheduled for May 20th. At that point, we're going to ask council consideration to move forward with the formal adoption process, which is phase 4 up on this diagram. The legislative land use process that phase 4 encompasses will likely take an additional 6 to 9 months, and it must be completed before any code amendments are actually implemented. This means that there are still more opportunities for involvement, and with Planning Commission holding a public hearing as well as City Council holding a public hearing, there's a few more bites at the apple and chances to make changes and adjust code as we go along. This is still a draft. I've received some useful feedback already, and you'll see as we go along, I've flagged a couple areas. I'm gonna be kind of bouncing between a PowerPoint presentation to kind of go over some presentation pieces as we move through the draft code. And then I've also got a Word document that I have set up and track changes so that we can potentially make little adjustments if we need to as we go. But getting constructive feedback and suggestions really helps to refine the code as we go through. So thank you to those who have, and I still encourage more. Before we go, I also wanted to talk about the batch processing. As I mentioned, we're here for batch 2 tonight. Last fall, we split the recommendations of draft code writing into 2 batches. So in November, you reviewed batch 1 recommendations, and then council advanced them, also reviewed them and advanced them to code writing. And then you went through the batch 1 draft amendments in February. So a reminder, batch 1 included the maintenance issues and the less complex and significant issues. So there was quite a bit of them, but they were much easier to get through. In December, you reviewed the recommendations for batch 2, the more complex, significant issues, and then council also reviewed the recommendations with some changes from you and advanced those to the code writing phase in January. So today and next Tuesday, as I said, we'll work through the draft code that we're implementing those recommendations. Some of these are definitely more complex. For example, some of them deal with planned unit development standards or criteria, and especially some of them that are implementing the South Hill study policy. Other topics such as geotechnical and trees are more complex and or controversial. We released the draft amendments to interested parties for feedback on March 29th, and there have been a few specific questions or clarifications, and a couple people provided more specific feedback. Those emails were all forwarded to you, and you should have a copy of those, a hard copy in front of you as well. So you've seen several comments regarding the public process for this project, so I also thought that this was a good time to go back to where we began in planning the project outreach. Phase 4, our legislative land use process for code amendments, fulfills requirements for statewide planning goal 1, citizen involvement. This current process is essentially a pre-process to the formal adoption process. This is the International Association of Public Participation, or IAP2's spectrum of public participation. It shows varying levels of engagement based on impact on the decision. Hopefully you can kind of read that, but we're going to stay on this slide for a few minutes. So it was important to engage stakeholders before drafting proposed changes to the clear and objective tracks. This allowed us to hear from users of the code as well as from people affected by the outcomes of development. This project is tasked with trying to harmonize multiple community values: compact urban development, housing that is affordable at all incomes, natural resources, and neighborhood livability, to name a few. That's why our goal is to improve efficiency and effectiveness. And that's why we wanted to have this pre-process to gather input early on. Based on the general applicability of this project, it applies citywide. It's not area specific. Its technical nature and the council's directed timeline, the project was designed, and this is also outlined in the approved public involvement plan. It was designed to consult with the public and stakeholders during phase 1, which we did by gathering feedback and suggestions on key issues through the focus groups and listening sessions that we did, and to involve stakeholders during phase 2. And this was the purpose of the 4 working group meetings, when stakeholders helped generate and vet possible preferred concepts. You, Planning Commission, as an at-large citizen volunteers appointed by our elected officials, are engaged at the collaborative level. We have checked in with you at each project milestone. You've provided guidance to identify preferred concepts, and we look to you now for guidance in refining and recommending draft amendments for the Eugene City Council to consider. Ultimately, as council is an elected body, the public is collectively represented at the empower level through the council decisions. While the level of engagement has varied with the requirements of each phase, throughout the process we have kept the public informed about the status of the project and the outcomes through direct emails to interested parties, articles in the Envision Eugene newsletter, keeping the project website up to date, as well as providing opportunities to weigh in on materials prior to your review. And then again, that's just our phase diagram. So again, the bulk of the public involvement and engagement really was intended to be in the early stages of this project. So for tonight, here's how we're going to tackle all of the code sections we need to get through. For the most part, we're going to go through in numerical order as it is in the packet, and I've tried to outline some of the page numbers here that will be found on. And we'll go through them for the most part as they come. We're going to hold the tree preservation standards for next Tuesday. And to some extent, there's a few things that we'll want to jump around a little bit because implementing one recommendation might have triggered a change in another little section. So I'll try to do it in as intuitive way as we can. And I'll definitely point you where we're going, and we're going to have it up on the screen as we go. So before we dive in, I've been using an analogy that I think really demonstrates one of the challenges with trying to craft clear and objective code. If any of you have kids, or I know Commissioner Fragola probably knows this science project experiment, but I know mine have done it, where there's a science project where you need to write out detailed instructions on how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And then the teacher tries to follow the instructions. And it usually causes a lot of laughter because silly things happen, like the teacher doesn't pull the peanut butter out of the cupboard, or the teacher tries to stick the knife through the lid of the peanut butter jar because you didn't tell them to take it off or to take it out of the cabinet. So that is somewhat what trying to craft clear and objective language is like. And just when you think you've got it clear and objective and really clear what it means, somebody reads it, not pointing fingers, and and points out, but, and so it's really, it's going to take a lot of review and a lot of really good feedback and critical feedback and constructive feedback to point out those kind of catching points. And whether it's a catching point because it's not specific enough, or as Ed mentioned, if it's something that seems to be going too far, I guess my call to people who are out there or at all either involved or considering being involved is to consider trying to come to the table and offering some suggestions and seeing how to push it the direction that you'd like to see versus just throwing it out. I think that it's a real shame. I really think that we can get to some really workable solutions if people can throw things out and have an open and honest and safe dialogue around it. So with that said, you guys can give me as much feedback tonight as you can. So I'm going to first start with compatibility. So I'll bring up the code in a second, but before we go into that, I did want to talk a little bit about the first recommendation that we're going to cover. For this one, the recommendation was to add a compatibility criterion that would apply to higher intensity development when it abuts lower intensity development. So, one of the things we talked about was trying to make it make more sense when it applies. One of the things that had come out as a comment was early on was this was sometimes we have really blunt tools in the clear and objective process, like the 30-foot buffer for PUDs that's intended to address compatibility, but it ends up applying to a single-family subdivision next to a single-family subdivision. And so then you question the use of that 30-foot buffer, whether that's an efficient use of land. So the transition standards are designed to apply to planned unit developments, conditional use permits, or site reviews when it's triggered because the proposed use is a higher intensity use next to property that's zoned R1 or R1.5. And that brings up the first change. We did go through the special area zones. That was one of the comments. And there were two special area zones that we've added to the language that you'll see that it appeared would be more like an R1 use that we would want those transition standards to kick in for. And I do have, because there's 4 options, our approach to this was to have 4 different, kind of a menu of options. So 4 different options where you could address some transition standards through either distance or a height limit or landscaping, and to give some options. So option 1, we'll go over to the code in a minute, but first I think it might be helpful to just kind of give you a brief overview of all 4 options and then go over to the code, or would you prefer like option 1 and code for option 1, or do you think?
I'm going to throw this idea out and see what you guys think. I think because of especially this one, there are a couple of standards that are actually quite complex. So I think you providing an overview is going to be helpful to actually keep it all in context, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
And then afterwards, we can target each option or each part of the code individually. And if we need to go back to talk to about an option, we can. But I think that holistic understanding because of the
transition standards as a whole.
Yeah.
Okay. And we can
Does that
always
make sense?
toggle
I'm
back and
seeing
forth to the
heads.
images.
Okay. Okay, great.
You have something?
I actually just want to say, if anybody's here hoping to be at the Human Rights Commission meeting, it is upstairs on the 3rd floor. So,
Okay.
noticed a couple.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so a brief overview of option 1. Option 1 is the one that uses mostly a building height restriction, and so it's limits the new building or building addition to 35 feet. As a comparison, R1 building height maximum is 30 feet, and R1.5 and R2 are both 35 feet. So this is kind of mimicking the typical transition from R1 to R1.5 or R2. It also requires either a fence or a wall in between the 2 properties, or a landscape buffer that includes high screen hedge or bushes. We would allow driveways and alley or off of an alley to intersect. So we made sure to add that. But this is an example of kind of the worst case scenario. So the images that we're showing you, we tried to kind of maximize. So like this is a 35-foot structure. It wouldn't exceed this. This would be the maximum height that you could be, but this is with your standard 5-foot setback. If they chose the landscaping option, that would increase that 5-foot setback to 7 foot because it's a 7-foot landscape buffer. But that gives you an idea of option 1.
Can I ask you a favor? You've already said it for this one, but at the beginning, I think it might be helpful. Let me know if this is. Compare it to what it is now, so they understand where it's moving from. So it's 30 feet. So what?
Well, for PUDs, it's moving from a standard 30-foot buffer along the perimeter. So if this was the perimeter lot, or the edge lot in a proposed PUD, and then an R1 house there, then that would have required a 30-foot setback.
Great.
For site review and conditional use permits, however, they would just meet that 5-foot setback and then whatever the maximum height was for their zone. So if it was a site review in, say, R3, that's 50 feet. If it's R4, it's...
There's a setback within so many feet of the R1.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
The 30-foot. Yeah, there's an odd extra setback for R3 or R4.
But it actually requires, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it requires the building height to be lower
Within the setback.
within the setback.
And maybe as you continue, Alyssa can do the research,
Yeah,
that's
I'll-
fine.
Yeah.
I think, is that helpful? Because I think it's
is.
interesting to be, if you didn't have a chance to look at, yes.
So could we have an example of how site review, what is an exact, or not even an average, any kind of example of how site review would trigger this requirement?
So so a site review might be required for a multifamily project that has a site review overlay on the property. And so the fact that there'd be a site review overlay could trigger it. There aren't really uses that trigger it through the use on site review, but conditional uses for assisted living would probably be the main one that we would see, would be an assisted living in R1 that, or I guess R2, or, yeah,
So it has an existing site review attached to the property,
overlay attached to the property.
and that's the only way you could trigger, as far as you can imagine, site review.
I think so.
Unless there's a use, and off the top of my head, I don't remember what all if there's actually a residential use that triggers a site review in the table. I can't remember that.
I think early on when we did the analysis, because one of the early options was to basically not require site review for needed housing or for clear and objective track. Part of the reasoning that we kept it was because without this transition standards, there wasn't really there's no difference between a site review or little difference between a site review and the development standards. They're pointing to several development standards that would apply regardless. The compatibility criterion, which is, something being added, would actually add some more to the site review. And the discretionary track does have a compatibility component. Did you find that, or?
So two things. One, a manufactured home park in the R1 zone, you can either meet a set of standards or go through a site review. So there is one. In terms of building height, in the R3 and R4 zone, the maximum building height is limited to 30 feet for the portion of the building located within 50 feet from an abutting boundary or directly across the alley from land zoned R1.
R1.
Yeah, so that would actually supersede
Mhm.
this.
Potentially, yeah. Only for R3 and R4,
Adjacent to R1, yeah.
adjacent to R1, right.
So it would be more restrictive than this, and it would apply in those cases.
One of the differences with this is that it applies regardless of the zone, if it's multifamily or assisted care, certain types of uses, and next to R1. So whereas what Alyssa just read is only R3, is a limitation only on R3 and R4 properties adjacent to R1.
Adjacent to.
Right, so it's a more specific limitation that kicks in once in a while with
And
that.
someone building in that condition would be subject to that requirement, not these. These are not available to them.
This applies to all buildings that meet this condition. If they're going straight to building permit, if they're going to
Right.
site review, if they're going to clear and objective site review, this would apply.
So can I re-ask the question? So when you run into a conflict where there's two code requirements, explain how the code addresses that, where you've got two code sections? Is it the most restrictive that's actually going to apply? I know certain code sections, it says this code section actually is going to supersede all others. So how's the transition working?
I'll speak and then let Lauren correct me
Okay.
if I'm wrong. You're correct. There are certain sections that actually say in the case where there's multiple and they disagree, this section rules, not in those exact words.
Yeah.
But where they don't, but two things are triggered. We look at it as if both apply, and so yes, but you would go with the more restrictive. Supersedes the less restrictive standard
Okay.
without that being made abundantly clear.
Okay, great. Commissioner Ramey, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm running, I'm running hard here. I think I'm catching up, yeah.
Okay. Lauren, did you have anything to add to that? Okay, Janessa, good job. And Commissioner Edwards, do you have something?
I just had a question related to the change in density. Is that something that, I mean, is there densities that are already factored in that we've already looked at as far as, within a UGB, there's, because if you're talking about adding a transition zone that I'm assuming reduces the density in between two zones that are, is that making sense?
Are you talking about the
So-
inventory? Just in
Yeah,
terms
so
of
I'm just thinking,
expectation?
is it going from, a higher density to taking it down a little bit because it's in this transition, I mean, if you're talking about height, lowering heights or whatever else, I'm just wondering how that's factored into the overall inventory citywide, if that makes sense.
Yeah, think I'm kind of following what you're saying. I think that it's not intended that this is a straight, that this would have a huge impact on density. There's other requirements and a lot of overlaps too, for instance, on the two options where you can set back either 30 feet or 50 feet, there are a lot of allowed things that can occur within that setback area that are probably required on site anyway. Multifamily standards do require a certain amount of open space. You're going to have parking areas. You're going to have vehicle use areas, stormwater treatment facilities. That was something that we added in. And so I don't believe it would be a huge impact, but that analysis isn't necessarily done, and I'm not quite sure how we could do that easily. But I think that these would mostly be effective when it's R3, R4 next to R1.
Right.
It's really going to be more important on the when the difference between the densities is significant.
Okay, thank you.
So option one, this is 5-foot setback still, wall or fence, or landscaping buffer, and 35-foot height restriction. So like you said, R2, it doesn't really change. Option two, this one increases the interior yard setback to 10 feet. So typical, if you were an R2 and you're not triggering the R3, R4, a lot of times it's a 5-foot setback requirement. So this one requires a 10-foot setback from any portion of the property line that abuts or is directly across an alley from land zoned R1, R1.5, and then the two zones that we've added that are special area would be the special chambers, R1 sub area, and the special royal node. So on this one also incorporates a sloped setback. So starting at a point that's 25 feet above grade, the interior yard setback slopes at the rate of 10 inches vertically for every 12 inches horizontally, up into a point that's 50 feet away from the property line. This building that's shown on the right demonstrates meeting that slope setback, to give you an idea of what that would look like. This requirement also includes some additional tree plantings but along that property, the shared property line, and also requires either a 6-foot fence or masonry wall or the landscaping requirement, and has the allowance to be pierced by vehicle use areas. Option 3 moves to a 30-foot setback. This one, again, is increasing the distance. This one also requires some tree plantings in that 30-foot setback area along the property line. And you can use it for vehicle use area or a number of uses that are spelled out. We'll go through that when we look at the code. So it's a bigger setback, includes some trees. And then the last option increases that setback even more, but doesn't require the trees. So this is one option where we showed, okay, they're going to utilize it for vehicle parking area. The parking area itself would trigger the requirement for landscaping along the perimeter, so that's what those trees are there to demonstrate. Theoretically, though, you could have, if it was open space and just, lawn, you could do the 50-foot setback without requiring that. Okay. The other thing on the 50-foot, on this one that I wanted to mention is that it's 50 feet or the height of the tallest building on the development site, but it's whichever is less. So 50 feet is the cap. It wouldn't be taller than that, or wider than that, rather. I was going to point out, you don't have to read this, but just because I knew the question might come up, yes, building height is defined in code already, and this is considered clear and objective. It's applied to building permits, and it does prescribe how you measure building height. So now I'm going to pop over to the Word document where we have the draft code. And
So, Janessa, do you want to take a moment just to make sure
yeah.
if people understood the options, ask some questions before we actually get into the code language? Does that make sense?
Sure.
So are there any questions that the Planning Commission has based on the options, just to basically understand it before we dive into the code suggestions? Yeah, Commissioner Randall?
I think this might be the appropriate place for this question, but maybe
Yeah.
not. My question is, do you know how many, let's say, R3 and R4 zoned properties are directly adjacent to R1s and R1.5, which I've got another question later about R1.5, but because I know R2 is limited in height already
35 feet.
substantially to the 35 feet, so it's not too much unlike the R1 zone, which is limited to 30. But R3 and R4 are what really get into those higher allowable building heights. And I guess I'm just wondering, since this is pretty clear on trying to get that separation, I'm not as concerned about adjacent to an R2. I would be concerned about R3 and R4, but I'm just wondering how many places in town are there like that? Is it a lot, just a few?
I don't have a count on it. I can tell you that there are areas that, in an ideal situation, R2 would have been plugged in as a nice transition,
Right.
between the higher, and I know we have areas that do border R1,
I'm
and a
familiar
higher
with
density.
There's one, I think, over near the university that I'm
University
aware
area.
of, but I'm really not sure I know of any others around. I don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to look.
So, okay, that's a
just
good question. I think
That's just an overall general question that I have just to get a sense of how many places this is actually going to apply.
It's probably a good question to at least understand what that is for city council.
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be tonight.
Well, I was just going to say.
Commissioner Borowski, yeah.
That also has other implications because there's what it's zoned now and what it is zoned on the metro plan, so there's.
The designation.
There's designations that could be upzoned that would have to be considered as well. Sure.
So, it's basically a two-sided question, right? So Commissioner Randall, did you have another question? Sorry.
No, at this point, that's it.
Okay, anybody else? I'm going to throw so one of the questions I have, I'm going to start here, this might be one of those complex questions, is I'm seeing the transition standards, this is kind of my perspective pulling it out. It almost seems like the transition standards are there for a particular reason. But it's not necessarily applicable to all of the things covered. Does that make sense? So it's kind of, it's taking a more blanket approach for a particular scenario. And I'll get more specific. So let's say how many CUPs and site reviews that are discretionary actually have decisions that modify setback and heights because of the criteria in the land use process? The reason why I'm asking that is this is quite significant in terms of choice, potentially. Now, okay, PUDs may be a little different because you've got a pretty intense development, right? Larger lot size, potentially bordering. It's got more influence in the community when it's going in, assuming it's a larger parcel or multiple parcels. What about that single property that has one assisted living facility? How many CUPs and site reviews have gone through in a discretionary manner that the end decision actually modified the setback and modified the height? And the reason why I'm asking that is, does the discretionary standards actually get you to that? And my thought is maybe it doesn't. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking a transition area and we're making what we want to have is an easier, so what's the word you used? Mitigate barriers to housing, right? So in the discretionary track, you're going to, it could force a discretionary track, granted, okay, there's a public process, it's clear, but you're actually having more cumbersome transition options for something that we have no history. So you're actually instituting in code greater compatibility standards for clear and objective that aren't in the discretionary. Now, discretionary, the discretionary is there for the public to provide feedback, right? You've got compatibility, you've got a CUP, they're saying, wait a minute, this isn't compatible. I wonder how many times, because the code is actually fairly clear. Here's the setback, here's the height. There are other elements within the code that deal with compatibility. So it's a bigger question, and I think I think it's a valid one, because I think a single lot versus a PUD, site review, CUP, PUD, they have different characteristics. So is this really the direction we want to go? I mean, do you see what I'm saying? And I'm just throwing it out there.
I do, if I could, I
Yes,
can
of
respond
course.
a little
Of
bit
course.
to, one, we wouldn't necessarily require a larger setback, but I can't say that developers or applications haven't come through where they've placed opted for a larger setback and then used that in their narrative to support the fact that they're meeting the compatibility criterion. So it's a little bit hard to tease that out. Can we do an analysis and say, it came out, these are the same things that came out of, this many past decisions? I don't think we can do that to validate this that way. These were meant to be responsive to concerns that we heard around privacy, things that came up, and typically it was more around, when you have the R1 next to an R3 or where you have a greater height allowance. And you might have third story, windows and stuff. And so that's why the planting component was put in here to help screen some of those or the combination of distance. So, I mean, I understand what you're saying.
That's a complex, you're right.
I guess that, I mean, here, welcome to my world.
Right, sure.
This is the difficulty. And so that's, again, where I'm looking for guidance on if these seem excessive to you or to anyone, how can they be made not as excessive but still address some of these issues in a clear and objective manner?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's where I think this is where you polish and hone the sharp rock, right? And make it a nice one.
Okay, thank you. That was a good answer. I think for the next step, just because we do have more process in front of us, I think that's an interesting, I mean, there could even be LUBA decisions. What I want to, and I might be overcomplicating this to some degree. At the same time, I do want to make sure, and so more on a higher level, are we taking a clear and objective process and I recognize what you're balancing. I see what's happening here. There's compatibility challenges. I heard it through the process. So the discretionary track doesn't have the same parameters, yet it's discretionary, right? So, if somebody came in and proposed the setback per code, height per code, there is criteria. Now, is the criteria going to get you there? So I think actually having some understanding of what that is, and I can look at it. I mean, I'm willing to spend some time, because do you see where I'm going in terms of if discretionary historically doesn't actually enforce that, then do we just create a clear and objective path that actually isn't getting us to a more cost-effective, simpler way to actually get housing?
And effective.
Yeah, and effective. Sorry, I wanted all my words. Thank you. So I think we can drop it now. It's just, it's going to be something that I'm going to watch for, and you'll hear it in some of my comments. And unfortunately, I just didn't spend the time to do that cross-examination.
Okay. The other thing I want to point out is that these came from, in part, some historical work that we've done in other areas looking at potential transition standards. So these aren't necessarily brand new. And in addition, there was consultant feedback on these. And so some of these came from suggestions based on what some other communities in her experience have done.
Okay.
So, they're unique in that it's a unique combination of these specific requirements, but they're not brand new and out of thin air, if that helps.
Okay, Commissioner Borowski, thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad that we're talking about transition standards. So Mr. Randall can attest that this is something that we've been struggling with for the last, since I've been on the planning commission, and I'm sure probably since he has. The idea, when we decided that we were going to densify along the corridors, what we heard was we need transition standards. And I think this is the first real bite at the apple that we've had at it, other than some things in some special area zones like the Walnut mixed use. I think we had a successful bite at the apple there with the transition standards that were done.
Well, it was certainly a bite.
Yes. So that being said, I'm in favor of this. I'm not as familiar with the workings of it as some of the other commissioners at the table, but I'm glad that we're doing something that, one, will address the difference between R1 and higher density zones. And what we put up there, I think, is a good start. I'm not real tied to those exact sizes or whatever, but I think the concept I'm very happy with. There is one thing that I did see when we're talking about the applicable standards, and that it is anything that is abutting or directly across from a public alley or land zone R1 or R1.5. In Walnut Special Area Zone, there's also one that says lots abutting parks and recreation and open spaces. For me, I don't know if that's addressed someplace else in the code, but I think that these transition standards would be appropriate to apply to those areas as well. I mean, if you're putting a 3-story, 4-story building right next to a park or open spaces, I think that these might be appropriate to put in there as well. It's just something that I thought might be worth looking into, adding that section. There's a section in Walnut Mixed Use that says that lots of budding parks and recreation and open spaces within that are adjusted, so that that might be another area to have these transition standards apply, not just across the alley from R1. I don't know.
Commissioner Fragola.
In looking at this, I certainly don't have the technical expertise at the level that some of the other commissioners have, but I really am happy that we're looking at transition standards also. I know from the earlier work group, there was strong support from stakeholders that we really take a dive into this, and some of the things that you included were recommendations that came out of that work group. The other thing that I like about what is drafted here is that there are multiple options. And I like that there are options included. And I think that the way that this is designed is looking at the recommendations that came out of the work group that were important, but then also giving developers options to work with, right? And I think that's kind of the balancing act that we want to look at, right? We want to be able to balance the livability that people want in creating these transition zones, but we also want to be able to give developers an ability to evaluate and work with what they're working with, so.
Commissioner Randall, thank you.
Yes, and I guess I do want to say I appreciate that we are doing the transition standards, and it is something that's been on our radar for a very long time. And so it is good to see this finally happening, and I think especially as we develop along our transit corridors and what we're wanting to do that way, this is going to be very important. It's good to get the groundwork laid for that now, so that as we progress, that we're in better shape, especially on those projects. I'm going to go ahead and throw in my second question that I was going to save for later, and it's similar to the how many R3s and R4s there are adjacent to R1s, and it's how many R1.5s are there? Is it just the one over on Walnut, and that's the only one in the entire city? Okay. Is it something that we should consider even having in here? I mean, I guess it's still a zone, but can we kind of let them be their zone and move on? It's just a thought, because I don't ever get a client asking to do a zone change to R1.5.
Okay, great. I'm going to say one other thing, then we'll move on, is a clarification. So I want to make sure I have heard, so there's two issues I look at. Is one, transitions. We've heard from the public, right? So my comment is around clear is actually the process in front of us. That's clear and objective and discretionary. I want transitions. I want clear and objective to serve the purposes that we are trying to achieve. So that's really what I'm questioning, is are we getting something more clear, more efficient, more cost-effective, mitigate barriers to housing with clear and objective? Because what I don't want to happen is for us to have a process that actually what's going to happen is people are going to slow it down. It's going to get into discretionary. I think these compatibility and transition standards are actually, I'd love to see that being addressed in the discretionary side too as well, right? So that's really what we're talking about. That's not in front of us today. So and I want us to be thoughtful about using this process to throw a bunch of other things into it.
Are you saying that these things don't exist in the discretionary and that they also need to exist in the discretionary?
That's a question. Yes.
And I would say this is a prescriptive list, because that is the nature of clear and objective, is that you have to make it prescriptive if you're going to try to specifically address something. Discretionary, we're able to put a one-line sentence that says you need to be compatible with your neighbor, and because it's an optional discretionary process, you make the argument. The burden of proof is still on the applicant to show that they meet that criterion. But the flexibility is there for more creativity in how you meet that criterion, versus with a clear and objective standard, you are more box ticking. I mean, that is to some extent inevitable with clear and objective, I think, is that, but you can create a menu of possibilities, which was what we tried to get at. So, it appears complicated because it's longer, but I don't feel like it's complicated in how hard it is to understand, versus that it's providing as many possible options and in order to address the kind of, well, that doesn't really fit this site, and we'd be much better off planting some trees and being able to build closer to the property line, or, versus the other one. So just trying to build in some variation and flexibility while still being clear and objective. And so if there are other ways to approach it, or if these can be adjusted to work better, then I think that's the direction I would like.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ramey.
So I guess we're moving on from this. I just had a couple of things
Yeah.
on this one. The transition areas was something I was very interested in to begin with. Commissioner Randall's example in the West University, where R1 is right next to R4, and those are built, a lot of them, and that didn't really work well, I don't think, for anybody. So having some kind, and I don't know, this doesn't apply to that unless something's in a site review currently, right? It wouldn't apply to a one-on-one property like they had there. So that tool that's available for that right now is that setback of 50 feet. So that's a pretty blunt tool. So moving these ahead, I think there's a limited amount of instances where these will apply, first of all.
Yes.
Secondly, I really commend it, and I commend the idea that there are more than one choice. Because I think while it reads complicated, it took me several sketches and a conversation to figure it out. Once I got traction with it, then I go, okay, I understand what they're happening here. So you can choose one of these 4 tracks, and you're not going to be subjected to somebody's opinion about whether you did was right or not. That's it. You're going to go to the counter, you're going to get your permit, you're done. So that's what we're trying to do, I think. So then I have one last comment about if the goal was to block sort of the views from the larger developments to the lower density, I think we got there pretty much. There's also an issue about activity and noise and even light, and I think the fences kind of get to that. But when we get into the options where we start to lose the fences, there are some activities that need additional screening, and those are things like trash enclosures, bike parking, motorcycle parking, and I think a lot of those are already covered in the multifamily zone. But I just wanted to point out that even though we're dropping the fence at some of those larger areas, if you did do something like a trash enclosure, you'd still have to screen it. And that's already covered with the code.
Correct.
Right.
The garbage screening is covered.
So I'm done.
Great. Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, one other little thing that I found, and it's at the last section, it was the tree exception, that you could get an exception from tree planting if you got a waiver from the adjoining neighbors. That doesn't work for me, because the properties are gonna change hands. And so a neighbor may have a property and say, oh, I don't care if you plant the trees or not, but then he sells his house 6 months later, and the person buying it, or a developer buys the property and buys the property next door to him with the intent that I'll not have to do my tree planting, and then sells it after the development is made. So I'm not comfortable with section D there.
I'm going to scroll down to that section.
Okay, it seems like that's a good segue. If you want to, we'll move to the code section. I don't know if you want to kind of highlight it. We can start at the top and maybe I'll let you lead it, Janessa.
Do you want to continue on with the tree exception now?
You
before
sure?
we go back to
Because
the
it's
top?
brought up and then we'll go to the top. That's great.
So, right, so there are 2 options that require planting of trees that are at least 20, would grow to at least 20 feet tall in that transition area. And so this exception was put in there because sometimes the idea behind this was that sometimes people don't want a tree because of solar access, or maybe they don't want their backyard shaded. And so if you've got a neighbor who really doesn't want it, we don't really, without building something like this in, we don't have a way to accept it from the requirement. So that's just the background. You guys can tell me which way to go with it.
I'll just add briefly, in previous discussions where we talked about transitions, that actually came up from folks in the community as saying, oh, geez, we wouldn't want to require something that was actually more of an impact for someone next door. So just like Janessa said, it's a safety valve for that concern.
Commissioner Ramey.
And I think it's also a resale issue. If you sign away something like that and it's detrimental to the value of your property and you try to sell it, you've reduced the value of your property. So there's an incentive for that property owner not to sign it unless there really is some reason to not decrease the value of their property. Does that make sense? So there's a little bit of incentive.
Commissioner Randall?
I guess my question on this is this a deed restriction, or is it, so it's just a letter, it's a one-time thing with that owner? If that property then sells to a new owner, then it's basically null and void, and, I mean, you don't have to come back and plant the trees,
Right.
but
If the development that would have planted the tree comes in to do further development that again would impact that same area and that property
new
has
letter.
sold, they would need to go to the current property owner and see if they want it or not and go through the process again to get an exception.
I think I'm comfortable with that section.
I was going to say, I like the flexibility for the reason that staff identified. It just adds that flexibility for that owner. They are trees, so if somebody purchased the property and there wasn't additional development proposed that required a new exception because it triggered this code section, that owner can plant a tree in the location. But if the person currently living there, if it's something detrimental to them, I like the flexibility because it isn't a clear and objective standard, so.
The other thing, just before we go back to the top, I just want to also point out that, and it's right in the applicability that we're going to go back to, that these standards that would only apply on the portion of the property line that is abutting an R1 property or something. So where, it's easy to think of the 30-foot perimeter buffer that applies all the way around something. This would be very specifically to the area that is a transition between a higher intensity and a lower intensity. So just to keep that in mind, that it's not necessarily as all-encompassing as it would appear. Okay, so the first paragraph I highlighted here because one of the comments that came in was asking whether livable was a defined term. And livable area is defined in code. Living area is defined in code. This is something that we could potentially add a definition for livable floor area to be clear and maybe define it by accepting out what isn't. It might almost be easier to do it that way. So that's just one that I think was a good catch that we could discuss how to address it.
Okay, what I'm going to suggest is let's stay within subsection 1. And we'll bring up any comments having to do with subsection 1.
I like that.
So is any commissioners want to start? I can put myself in the queue and start. I'm not seeing any. Okay. I like the idea of a definition. There is living area and there's floor area in the definition section. I think that could create confusion potentially. So I really do like the idea of adding a definition. So I think that's great. The other thing is in section 1, it's interesting if you read at the end of the sentence, right? So you basically start with applicability and right after housing and objective, period, the transition standards apply to all new buildings. They are 2 separate sentences. I think to avoid confusion in interpretation, and needs to be there. Okay. Something needs to actually pull the 2 together. Because essentially you've got all these land use applications applicable because of all these land use applications, period. Then it's got applicable if it's a new building and any building additions. But they're discretely separate. And when I read it a couple times, I was like, it's easy to just say and. This is applicable and this is applicable.
I think it may need to be
Worded different. So that was just, I looked at it a few times and I was like, okay, is it absolutely necessary? No, yet I think since we're sitting here, it could be clear. That's my only comment on that.
Did the commission have any other comments about the parks and open spaces? That would be in section 1 if we wanted to add it.
Oh, to add your comment, yeah.
That would be the appropriate place. And again,
And I guess what I was curious related to that is there any place else in the code that addresses that?
A transition between a development and a park or open space? I don't believe
Not
so.
aware of any, but
Did you want, Robin? Yeah, of course.
Just something worth considering around that. There are parks in town where the visual access from a place where people are living into a public park is actually really desirable. From a sort of natural observation standpoint, it helps keep the park safe, actually. So in some cases, you actually wouldn't want to be blocking the view. It's not true in all cases, and I think opinions would differ on that, but that's just something to think about. West University Park is a really good example. We went to great lengths to ensure the visual access, entrances, windows, balconies that actually are facing the park, which seems to have helped cure a problem that was there for decades, where a park was unusable due to negative activity. So that was really instrumental in turning that around. So just something to think about.
Yeah. Are there any other questions or comments regarding Commissioner Borowski's suggestion? Okay. Any other comments with subsection 1? Okay, we'll move to subsection 2.
And before we move on,
Yes.
should I, so did we
Do you
agree
want-
to
yeah.
add I think it might be hard to go back through once
Okay.
we've kind of cluttered our minds with each section
Okay,
along the
good.
way. So to be clear, we want to add a definition for livable floor area. Would that be the
Just,
term that we want to
show of
define?
hands?
I
Okay.
guess my only comment would be if livable area is already defined and it fits what we want here.
Living area.
Living area.
And it actually, the definition
And
is
it doesn't
quite
work
poor.
in
there's
this.
other terms
Yeah.
that are outdoor living area.
Yeah.
Okay,
So-
okay. Then I'm fine with that.
Just checking, I know that there's at least one other place in the code where livable floor area is, so we'll make sure that there's not a conflict with.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, and then as far as adding zones, we've added the special chambers R1 sub-area and the special royal node / LDR, low-density residential, was missing from that as well. So those are the two special area zones that would appear to trigger this. And then where, I'd like to know where we landed on the parks and whether there's anything more to.
So let me get a show of hands. It seemed like everybody was in favor of livable floor area. Look at the definition, make sure there's not a conflict. We like that idea, okay? And in terms of parks, Commissioner Borowski, all of those that would like to consider adding parks and open space. Okay, we've got maybe one, but Commissioner Borowski's not.
Can I just read the section from special area, from the Walnut Station and see if it makes sense?
Sure.
So it says, development on a lot within the special areas, Walnut Station, special area zone that is adjacent to the park, recreation, and open space zone shall treat those lot lines that abut the park and recreation and open space zone as street-facing lot lines and shall comply with the standards for transition edge. And this was 15th Avenue in the South Willamette, or the special area zones. So they're basically saying that if it's a park, you treat it like it's a street.
Sounds a little different than what we're.
If I could point out one other thing that might at least in part set your mind to rest, there are a lot of parks that are zoned R1, and so to some extent this will apply because it's triggered by the zone and not the use. There may be some parks that this would already apply to.
Yeah, Yeah, and like I said, I'm not wed to it. It was something that came up and I thought it might be appropriate.
I'll throw myself, I guess I would have to better understand, would want to look at the Walnut Mixed Use Station to actually look at what those what actually applies. I like consistency. I like to look at and applicability, obviously. So we're not creating uniqueness. So that would be my only concern is right now, I feel like I would like a little bit more information if it's something I'm going to consider.
I can live with that.
And, sorry, go ahead.
Well, go ahead if you're on that topic.
Actually, it's not.
I was just going to ask if there were other special area zones that this might need to apply to other than those.
This is the analysis that we looked through, and these were the two zones that are most similar to R1 that we felt that it would make sense to go ahead and add them to.
So one of the other questions, I guess, because I do want to address Commissioner Brodsky's, get a show of hand. We could just have staff before city council, just look at it and say that it was a discussion. I mean, that's another option, is that we don't have to throw it in here now. We can have them look at it, see if it's valid, and trust them to. So Commissioner Brodsky, you brought it
I
up.
would rather not
Okay.
have council have any idea about parks and open spaces and transitions if it doesn't.
Okay,
That's a can of worms at council.
okay.
We should be
Okay.
firm on what we're saying.
Okay, so let me get a show of hands. Who wants to include parks and open space in the list? Okay, there you go.
No parks. Well, no parks in there. Okay. So other than that, I think we're good on the one change in section 1, and nobody brought anything else up. The thing I was just going to say is just to be clear, or make sure that you're okay with the exceptions that we built in. We were trying to kind of look at, a single triplex on one lot or a fourplex on one lot, or if the structures are all under 30 feet, those are pretty R1, compatible developments. So, those would not trigger these standards.
Question on that. Are those three are the 1, 2, and 3 there for the exceptions are single sentences, so it's not cumulative. It's not like single triplex on one lot or a single
Each one of them is an exception in its own right.
its own right. Okay. I'm thinking you could have a fourplex that was quite large. Thinking some of the mansion apartments in the past for missing middle, but maybe that's something we would want.
Would it be more than 35 feet in an R2? It kind of, some of these, it kind of
Yeah.
gets around to where,
Yeah.
when you really think of it, like a fourplex on an R3 or an R4 lot may not meet density. And so you might be looking more at R2, in which case that's already going to have a 35-foot limit and it's already going to be pretty compatible with, R2 is the transition.
The scale I'm thinking
Zone.
of are similar to the ones along Lincoln between 6th and 7th on the west side. There's a palmistry and they've been redeveloped, but I think they were originally like fourplex mansion apartments, and so they're just like a large house. And I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just. Those are cool. Yeah, actually, I kind of like them, but just.
I think in part too, this was trying to be a little coordinated with where housing tools and strategies are going and the code audit and looking at missing middle types and recognizing that we're not wanting to add barriers to missing middle types as part of our process.
Okay.
So are we good with those? Okay, so we are hopefully going to go through these a little faster. So section 2, oh, where's my mouse? So the standards just introduce the 3 or the 4 options rather. So the height and setback options, and we've kind of talked about this. So I don't know if we want to go through each section, or in the interest of time, if anybody has any specifics, if we want to just go through those and kind of batch the rest of this.
What are people's thoughts? I I have a lot of comments, so we could go section by section. And I know it's consistent with other testimony. I actually did it before I read the testimony, so there's at least, so anyways, yes.
So you might want to look up here because
Yes.
that particular testimony that is somewhat wrapped into here.
Right.
And so like the yellow highlights, one of the, comments was on whether those dimensions were appropriate and a comment about fire code. The multifamily standards have a minimum width of 12 feet for one-way traffic and 20 feet for two-way traffic. We increased those a little bit to allow for, if the turn radius or something, we didn't want to be right at the minimum. So that's where these came from, and that's why that's highlighted there. I didn't change anything, but I wanted to point out the response to that comment. Down here, the minimum interval of 15 feet, I believe that's a reasonable interval. I've tried to reach out to a couple tree people. My understanding is that 10 feet is kind of a significant number, like that you don't want them closer than 10 feet together. But if anybody else has any other information, so far, to the best of my ability, 15 feet is an okay number, especially for trees that are probably not canopy huge trees. I highlighted this.
There was a word up above there. There was an extra option. Did you?
An extra option.
It's in 2A1.
2A1. Oh.
2B1.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's up the other two. There it is. 2A1. The proposed development must comply with one of the final sentence above that. There's the thing about where you could, oh, here it is, a little bit further down.
More?
One of the following options. Sorry, it's right above that.
At least one of the following options
There's
must
the
be
word
provided.
option.
Right, and you're right, we had discussed that, and we were going to
Parallel-
strike that.
Yeah, the next time you use it where it's highlighted, it just says at least one of the following.
Right.
It confused me because you were using the word option again.
We talked about that, that's right. And the other thing with this one, on option one thing to consider in coming up with this, there's been some talk about the walls or the fences, and so it may be that one possible direction or suggestion to simplify it would be to do away with the option B and just require a wall or a fence on that property line. So that would be an option too, not to say option more. Tiffany?
Commissioner
The only,
Edwards.
thank you. The only question I would have is, sometimes if you're doing something with like a wrought iron fence, but you have landscaping, which could be, in some cases more
Then you'd
desirable
have to
than
do
a
B.
wood fence. So then you'd want to be able to do B. And then I had a question though about the 20 to 30 foot planted trees. Does it require that they are that type of tree specifically? Because if you are planting a tree that will get taller than that, does that change what your interval would be?
That's one of the things that I put here was to maybe switch some of this language. I realized that this one was saying 20 to 30 feet, and another standard says at least 20 feet, and I think the at least 20 feet would be better to be consistent with that. And again, Robin, do you want to weigh in on the 15 feet? Or as a landscape architect?
That's consistent with conversations we'd had in the past where we talked about transitions. I think the intent is, obviously, the trees are supposed to be visual protection from a multi-story building next to, an R1 property. And the windows, the multi-story building, the second floor windows, right? They're going to be, I don't know what the height of that is, but the point is to have a tree of mature height between 20 and 30 feet. If you have a tree that gets a lot taller, you'll just have a trunk, and that doesn't really, serve the purpose. And so the idea is to have the tree canopy itself growing in that area, and it doesn't have to be taller than that necessarily. And the idea is that you have the ability for the canopy of two adjacent trees to grow together, right?
Right.
If the trees are too close together, they do get kind of crowded. 15 feet would, if a tree canopy grows 7 feet in one direction, that's not very much. So in a fairly short amount of time, you would have a tree that actually provides that site obscuring quality. That was the thinking, I think, originally behind that. So if that's helpful. Yeah.
Well, I just have a question. So, but if you're not required, if this doesn't require that you plant trees of a specific species or whatnot that only grow to this height, then you can't really, does that make sense? You mean, you might be planting ones that don't, well, I would assume you'd be planting something that will at least get to that height, but,
That was the purpose of specifying a mature height of between 20 and 30 feet.
yeah.
Which if you go to a
There's a
green,
list.
you can find out on the tag
Yeah.
what the mature height is.
Okay.
Commissioner Randall.
So then, in option 2B, instead of a mature height of at least 20 feet, would we go back to the 20 to 30 feet there? Sounds like that's what Robin's suggesting, and then I guess that begs the question down in option 3, where we just have a mature height of at least 20 feet, spaced a minimum interval 25 feet instead of 15, because you've got a larger setback there, which, I understand that, but then if the same logic's being used for screening, would you maybe want to also have the 20 to 30 feet on that as well, so that you're not getting just a real tall tree with just trunks there?
One difference in, I tend towards Commissioner Taylor's consistency kind of thing, and so that was why that change was recommended there. But in thinking it through too, in the other section where it's up to, or at least 20 feet, that's an area that could also be used as vehicle use area, in which case it would trigger the L3 standards that are canopy trees. And so that might have been the thinking on why that one was different and allowed at least 20, because if it's open space, then you could do your small trees or smaller trees, but if it's a parking area, your landscape trees would meet that tree requirement.
30-foot setback won't get you much parking.
No, it could be a vehicle use drive aisle, though, that would require the perimeter. You're right, it's not going to be a big parking lot.
So I want to throw myself in the queue, is that, that's why I know Commissioner Randall just stated it. I'd love to actually have you just explain, because I did notice, and I don't want to just assume that the inconsistencies are there for a certain reason, is that I did notice these inconsistencies. Once again, I would, where applicable, I'd make it consistent. It makes code confusing. Whereas if it's intentional, it'd be great for you to explain the intentionality, like the 30-foot setback, it's greater setback, so the interval between trees is greater. But if that isn't intentional, I would go to something consistent that makes sense in terms of viable trees that are healthy and can be maintained, and also makes sense in terms of effective screening. Yeah, so was that intentional, just between option 3 and option 2?
That's what I was saying here, is that option 2, you're not going to have a parking area, and so unless you opt in to the L3. Although the L3 is an option for all of them, so that may be an argument for staying with the at least 20 feet at maturity.
Yeah, so it's not only that, but just also the intervals. One is 15, the other
We could
is
change the
25. So was that intentional?
To be honest, that part came from the consultant, so I'm not defending that one
Okay.
as well, because that one didn't come directly from me.
Okay. Okay.
But again, those kind of dimensional things, that's a perfect example of where if 15 doesn't seem to be the mark, then let's change it and make it 20 or 25 or, and we can make it consistent.
So I just, this is uncomfortable for me. I'm the user of the code. So for me to right now on the fly, I'm just more thoughtful. It's like, I want to understand where the 15 and the 25 came from. How can you get livable, healthy trees? Have we created, are they too close? Are there other standards that are going to be actually happening at the same time? And now you've got too dense of a situation. You're going to have actually potentially trees not survive. So I don't know, that's why I'm just asking you, where did it come from? And if it's intentional, I just wanted to understand it. And are we achieving the goals? And if not, there's some of these, and that's where there's particular, like for instance, 2A, under option 2A, you've got a great graphic. It would be great to show that in actually a slope situation. Where we're actually telling the story for people that are user of the code. So, and basically exploring, and if you've already done this, this is what's helpful. Have you had someone take some pilot programs and actually look at what is the actual implication of the development? Because if we're sitting here just saying, oh yeah, 15's good or 25's great, I want to know, what does it look like if there's other codes that are, have we gone through the thoughtfulness to actually to impose these code sections? Does that make sense?
It does to some extent, but we haven't done sample analyses in all situations, and yeah.
Well, you can't do all, so of course not. I'm just wondering if you can share what you have done.
Well, what we have done is taken things that have been through other processes and other public processes even, and put it out there, and also hoped for getting some specific feedback on some of those issues from the design professionals that are part of our stakeholder group. Okay. That's where I look to feedback coming in to help craft that. And we haven't received any, this question about whether 15 feet was appropriate is kind of the only piece of direct feedback to speaking to that I've received. Okay. I'm not sure quite how to answer that.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you. No. Okay, so I have so I'm in a situation where today I feel like I need more information. Some of it's not totally clear. Well, how do I state? I would love a little bit more information about why decisions are being made. And I totally hear you. So between now and city council, it would be great to take some of these examples and see how it works, or do some of that investigation, or reach out to various people to get more feedback, like landscape architects, people that are actually using the code to find out what does that look like, so that we can make good choices, because it is clear and objective, and this is what we're going to move forward with. So anyways, that's one piece. The other is on section 3, option 3, there's a list. I would recommend wherever you have a list, open space, vehicle use area, bicycle parking, and pedestrian circulation, use the language directly from the code sections. So you've got stormwater treatment facilities. These are actually standards. So if that's what's intended, use the language that actually is already in the code, because I noticed there's some variation in how it's being stated. It just prevents that misinterpretation. Yeah.
That's good. Great. Yeah. These came in yesterday, and I was trying to respond to them today. And you're right, that I will make sure is consistent with the stormwater facility and how we refer to those other areas.
Great. There's some typo, there's some other, so section B, following interests are allowed. So if you look through subsection B under 4B, just to clarify, you might have already caught it, where it has subparagraphs A 2 through 4.
Up here, okay.
Yeah, you might want to
Or 2
actually have a
through
code
3.
section. I went and kind of tried to follow that. You have to kind of guess, where are you talking about? Subsection A, 2, 4. If you bump up, what subsection are you talking about in terms of A? Is it right above it?
Yeah, I think we're meaning A right above it.
Right
So-
above it.
So are you saying go back to EC 9.5?
Maybe, and actually what I'm realizing, it's because my printout, for some reason, is missing part of A. So it might be really clear, but I looked at it and I only have part of A, so to me, it didn't make sense because I don't have all of A. I just have B, C, and D, and I have yeah. I don't even have A in mine.
Oh, where did that?
Oh,
Yeah, I don't have. It's
No, because
for,
there's
A,
there's no A.
but the sentence makes sense.
Yeah, so
It's close,
there's a B,
but-
C, D, there's no A, and this says subparagraphs A 2 through 4.
And B, C, and D are currently only available under option 4.
Right.
And are you saying they should be maybe?
Well, I don't know what subparagraphs A 2 through 4, if A doesn't exist under 4. Anyways, maybe I'm the only one with this copy.
No, they're both.
I have the same thing.
Yeah.
There's no A.
There's no A, so I got confused and I tried to figure out where the A 2 through 4
I
is.
thought B applied to everything. So,
Option 1.
But B doesn't, so where's A?
right, that's what.
Oh, over here, is it this A that
I
then
don't know.
continues
I
to
could be.
Right.
So do you see where, if my confusion, I would add the whole section?
Yeah, I think it should be the whole citation. I think it's because this is talking about setbacks, intrusions into the additional setbacks required by this code section.
Yes.
And A1 doesn't have an added setback. That's the one that is,
Got it.
and that's why A1.
Okay, so it might make more sense in different,
Yes.
anyway, so whatever you guys think, I caught that and I was struggling, so.
Darn it.
Commissioner Randall?
And I guess my question is B or are B, C, and D intended to be only for option 4?
Yeah, I have the same question.
Or are
they
they,
apply to.
do they apply to all the options? Because it seems like,
So B takes you
balconies-
out, B takes you
out of
out,
4.
back out.
Right,
Of 4.
that's-
So it's again applying to everything.
that makes sense because the setback on
That's what I-
4 is 50 feet, and if your balcony has to be at least 20 feet,
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
yeah,
So B comes back out, B and following are like,
that's right, and eventually, that's what I figured it out
It'd be
eventually. Right now, I just didn't write good enough notes to figure out what I figured out.
And that's an area that, one of the people that brought up, if there, if you have sketches like you have.
Yeah.
that-
We do now, yeah.
Yeah, that may
Really
make it a lot clearer,
Mm-hmm.
in the zone, in Walnut area, that makes it very clear, so.
So, and why does this have to be different than EC 96745, parentheses 3 and C? I mean, what,
Yeah, I have the same question.
can we just use those?
If I recall, there might be more intrusions allowed in that. Again, this was a section that a consultant took the first, approach to crafting. And so that is something that they saw something problematic in that. So I can follow up with her to find out exactly why we were doing these in lieu of. But I assume it's because it's a smaller subset of allowed intrusions. And so otherwise, we would just rely on the other ones.
I think it is, because I think you can have bay windows
I can't,
in the intrusions and porches and different things that,
And that
You know,
begs the
one
question
here.
about why would we not allow bay windows or porches?
Yeah.
We allow.
I have so I'll throw myself in the queue. I have that same question. That's one of my questions. I looked at the comparison. I'm not quite sure. I'm unclear why they're being differentiated. Yeah.
And I think because it's meant to be a transition, and so I think it was just trying to limit the bites back into that transition area. And so that's definitely a decision that if you all agree, we could we could change this and have it apply the 9.6745 subsection 3 intrusions. I don't have strong feelings either way on that.
Did it have anything to do with clear and objective? I guess that would be my question, is that section, was it determined that it wasn't clear and objective?
I'd have to look back. I don't remember that being the issue.
It may have had to do with transitions, that you didn't want as many things looking into your R1.
I have a question.
Yeah, I don't know what, because I don't know what that's, I didn't read that section, so I'm sorry.
Commissioner Edward?
And I apologize if I'm jumping ahead, but I had a question on the balconies, decks, and other outdoor spaces, speaking to kind of what Robin said about the parks. So with that, I'm just trying to imagine if that would be a situation where you would actually want to be closer to abutting a park or something like that. Like if I'm thinking of an outdoor space, I don't know, I'm trying to picture what a above ground outdoor space. I mean, is that just like a back patio, or is that something that has to be?
Above ground means
Right.
above the ground floor.
Right.
It says above ground floor. So that's meaning second story or above, that those would need to be
Right.
set back
So
in
like
case
a
you had a
Right.
balcony or a roof terrace, that way they're not right up against the setback and.
That makes sense if you're right next to, another dwelling, but if it is up against a park or something else that would be zoned that way, does that make sense?
It does. I don't know that that's a very common
Yeah.
occurrence, so,
Trying to picture how that could apply, or like imagining what that might look like.
so it would only be if it was one of the parks zoned R1 that it might apply.
So one other question I have, throw myself in the queue, is I just want to clarify, slope setback area. I looked at the definition, is that defined? Once again, it's an interesting, all of a sudden it's thrown in. I looked at definitions, I couldn't find one.
It's the sloped portion of the interior yard, sloped setback area from to option 2. And so we could be more specific and say slope setback area as described in section 2, subsection 2. And so we could point back to that specific standard to clarify.
Yeah, I would just look at that, and just so we can avoid any question if we're trying to really achieve clear and objective.
It does say at the beginning that it's as described in subparagraphs 8(2) through 4.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah,
So
no, that's good, that's good.
that
That pulls
enough?
it back, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I think that
I
covers
mean, yeah,
what your concern is.
perfect, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I have two more, sorry. D, section D, future, the last sentence, can you just explain that to me a little bit? Future development proposals subject to the standards in this section will need to obtain a separate exemption for the tree planting requirements of this section.
So this is kind of what we talked about earlier, where if you've got a property owner who does the exception, who signs off, then they sell. And then the multifamily development, let's say, comes back in to do an addition or on a building that's again triggering these standards, then they need to go, if they want that exception, or they need to check with the current owner and get it again. So it's just making it clear that if you do this, you're not getting an exemption forever. But it's not a retroactive, it's not a deed restriction, and it doesn't mean that if that property sells that the new owner gets to say, hey, now I want a tree. It would only come up if there's further development that would again trigger these.
Okay, great, that's what I thought it was. I'm not sure your sentence gets you there clearly.
Okay.
Obtain a separate exemption. I mean, once again, I'm a user of this. I'm thinking about it very critically. Like, if I'm going to do clear and objective, what does obtain a separate exception? So you already have one. What does separate mean? So really you're saying you're obligated to do this again so just look at that sentence. It might be fine, but when I looked at it, I was like, oh, I can actually interpret this like 3 different ways, potentially, or I'm going to have a question. So I might be micromanaging it, but I would just look at it. And I'm fine with it.
So I'm going to highlight it right now.
Yep.
And my question about it is just, would it apply to a new owner or the existing owner if you were to go back and wanted, okay.
Either, well, right?
Yeah.
Either, because even if it's the same owner and you come back for another development, that owner may have changed their mind.
Yeah.
And so I think it's triggered at the time of each development.
So here's where I can be clear. Obtain a separate. So really what I'm hearing you say is you've got future development, it's going to trigger these standards. It's not really separate. You actually have to meet the standards. So separate means, are you saying I need to get another exemption for the tree that's already there? What's a separate, obtain a separate exemption? So it's that piece, because really what you're saying is, yeah, you've got to go through this again. And you've got to get the exceptions for the applicable, how you've triggered it. But you're not going back and getting a separate exception for anything else, other than what you're proposing that triggers these code standards, right? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Anything else in these sections? No, okay. So all those in favor, do you guys want to look at it again?
I'm going to highlight really quick the list because that's another thing I'm going to follow up on and make sure that they're consistently worded with the other references in code. So I think that was the only other one.
Right.
Which one? Oh, well, it's there again, but.
Commissioner Bobrowski,
So this is just a process question, I guess, as far as how the commission's moving forward in their recommendations on this. Because I found this in the past, whenever we're doing code, there may be sections that I'm not comfortable with, but that doesn't mean that I'm not comfortable with moving it forward as a whole. So how do you see this process going forward? So I'm still not okay with the tree exemption. And so do I need to vote against this whole first section because I'm not comfortable with one section? And then, in the past, we've had, straw poll votes that have been forwarded on to council. I just don't know how the commission wants to move these recommendations forward if they're not unanimous.
so do you want to, I think if that's the case, Commissioner Bobrowski, what I'd like to make a suggestion that we go through it by sections.
Section by
And just so we already have one, let's go to 2. How about that? Does it get you more at what you want? It's more of a question for you. What do you think?
I think it works, assuming that well, it's kind of hard because if there's one section that gets struck down, that may or may not be okay with the rest of keeping the integrity of the whole section. So I'm on the fly, I'm hesitating a little bit as to whether that will work completely. I think I'd like to have it feels like the tree exception is a particular catching point for Commissioner Bobrowski. And so it might be nice to know generally and to clarify that, is that the one thing that would turn your vote against it? Or I'm not sure if that's possible.
Well, I mean, like I said, in past deliberations, and this may have been, I don't know if they've been here on legislative things where that's happened. A lot of the commissioners haven't, but we said we moved this forward, and it was on a 6-1 vote, and that section type of deal. I don't know.
Like a minority report.
Well, and it didn't even require a minority report. It's just there's going to be parts of code that some people aren't going to be comfortable with, but that doesn't mean that the commission as a whole,
Right.
the majority of the commission doesn't feel in moving it forward. And then, so what happens is, maybe on this section, it's 6-1 or 5-1, but overall, then you do the overall recommendation of the thing, and that one's not gonna keep me from voting for it overall.
So let me make a suggestion. Why don't we vote 2 through 4? Let's see how the vote turns out, and I'll get to, basically, you're going to abstain. You can actually explain why. And then, yes, Commissioner Ramey.
One more detail. I think what we run the risk of doing in that case is flagging something for the council then to go, oh, let's spend 10 minutes digging into this provision. Is that what you intend? Because as a commission, we're saying, good to go. Or are we saying, good to go, except this section down here, we couldn't reach consensus on that section?
How we've
Triggers how they're going to
So
process it.
what I like to do, this is not a motion, this is a straw poll vote. So I do agree with you that historically what we've done is we have intentionally not done a kind of minority report. I'll just use that term. So I think I'd like to get an understanding of where people sit, because this conversation might just be Commissioner Borowski. Anyways, so unless, does that work? We can see, and if there aren't enough hands, then we have to evaluate how we should move forward on this section. Commissioner Edwards.
I just want to point out that this actually came up when council had the last batch. And because I can think of one counselor in particular, really wanted to understand why there was something that didn't have a unanimous vote, and they were very interested, and she very specifically said, minority reporter wants to know a little bit more. So I think that's kind of what we're addressing here is because we've had plenty of votes that weren't unanimous, but it wasn't necessarily changed the course or the recommendations altogether. But I do think that council, appreciates when there is some disagreement or discussion or suggestions by a specific, any one member or whatnot. So it did come up.
Lauren, yeah, please.
If I may, I don't know if this will be helpful, but I think right now Planning Commission is being asked to do a couple of different things kind of at the same time. So on the one hand, staff is asking for feedback about the proposed, specific to the proposed code language, and asking for any, requests that you might have from staff to make changes, to bring back something different, et cetera, before you make your final recommendation on the package to council. The other piece of it is that you will be making a final recommendation to council. And so the question that I think really is for the Planning Commission is how you want to structure that. And I have seen it structured different ways. And that could be structured as, just kind of one blanket recommendation that there's a vote at the very end on yes, we move the package forward, or no, we don't. And that's kind of all the information that goes. Or it could be more broken down to say, sort of like happened with some of the earlier batch pieces, here's the vote on this code provision, here's the vote on this code provision, these were unanimous, these were not. And that is, in my mind, completely up to the commission about how you want to present that information. But I think maybe it's worth, and I don't really have a good answer for this, trying to tease out a little bit the straw poll votes on what do we want staff to bring back to us? What sort of changes do we want staff to make? Do we need any changes to a particular code section versus we are happy with this code section and moving to recommend that it move forward. So I don't know if staff would be interested in a kind of second round where tonight what staff is asking for is feedback about changes. And then when those changes come back to you, then you do the vote on, are you okay with this code section? Are you, would you vote to recommend this code section? Would you not? But I am also cognizant that there's not a lot of time.
Would that be informed by the public hearing, or would that happen before? So won't we be having a public hearing on all of
Yeah,
this?
I mean, after council's meeting in May, assuming they say go forward with this, then we actually will start a formal adoption process, including a public hearing before the planning commission. Planning commission deliberations, where you will dig into this again, and you can make a recommendation to council. This one's a little more, in my mind, it's still a recommendation from you if you know, that you think they should go forward, but I think you should know that there's still more time to, you know, pick apart different pieces of it. Is it like, are you generally okay with the direction that this is headed? You know, can you, knowing that
Commissioner-
there's still a little bit more polishing time?
Commissioner Fregala.
So I guess I like the clarification that was just provided that, you know, this is, we're not at the place where we're making an official recommendation to the council. But what I would ask then is like, you know, the feedback that we're giving tonight, when are we gonna have a chance for that to come back? So that we then could take a more specific recommendation style deliberation. And I personally have heard from members on the council that they are interested in knowing why we don't have a complete consensus, you know, and that they do notice when we don't have a complete consensus on something. So rather than like not giving them information, then they kind of have to develop all these hypotheses in their brains. So I think it's useful to do what we did on the previous batch, where we break it down into pieces. And, you know, we take a straw poll vote and give some type of guidance to council. I guess I would be opposed to breaking like a code section down into lots of tiny pieces, right? I would rather like take this entire section that we just discussed, the transition standards, take some type of straw poll on that, and if somebody chooses to not go with the whole piece, to provide some clarity as to why we may have had why we didn't come to consensus.
So in the interest of time, we have 6 minutes left until 7:30. Commissioner Fragola actually just suggested what I suggested earlier. So unless staff has an opinion, I think based on where we are in the process, because I do understand Janessa's concern. If we start to look, especially at these options segmentally, we potentially create kind of some issues. So hearing where somebody might have a concern will be helpful to inform this process. Does that make sense? Please add.
It does, and I just want to point out that we started with one of the two biggest
Exactly.
sections. So this is really, I mean, most of these changes that are in this packet are probably going to go much quicker, and they're going to be much more discrete little, you know, snippets of change that are easier to do this. I still feel like on this, though, it feels like maybe one option would be to look at, you know, a vote on moving forward with the changes that you've said as a whole, including the tree exception, and then also vote for, or like, is there a way to vote for both? Both doing it in totality, or doing it with the exception of striking that that last subsection D that has the exception. And then if that one passes, then we would go with striking the subsection D.
Okay. Commissioner Randall.
I think from my perspective, what I'm hearing Commissioner Borowski say is that he's uncomfortable with D. It sounds like he's comfortable with pretty much the rest of it without putting words in your mouth. And I personally, you know, as we've been talking, you know, I think D could be tightened up a little as far as the wording. I think it's a little, I don't know, it's a little maybe unclear or maybe it just gets changed. But, and so I guess I'm comfortable if we're going to do sections but as far as moving it forward, because we are still going to have public hearing deliberations in that as well.
So Commissioner Borowski.
I guess, and Well, you might be able to help me out. I recall a situation very similar to this, that Commissioner Mills was adamant about one specific section. And he voted no on it because he wasn't comfortable with the section. It moved on and it passed through the legislative process. And I was just wondering if that's the same process that we're gonna go through here. If there's a section that I'm not comfortable with, I shouldn't have to vote for it. There should be an opportunity for me to vote against that. And whether that means I vote against that whole section, or whether there's some mechanism to vote against just that sub-paragraph, I feel that that's something that is my duty as a planning commissioner. And so I just am looking for the process to be able to put that out there. That's all. That's why I asked the question.
So I'm going to lean on Lauren. There's a lot of different ideas. I want to have an effective outcome. If you can just tell us what to do, please.
My recommendation would be to take a straw poll vote on the entire 9.5860 transition standards code section, with the understanding that Commissioner Brodsky will probably vote no because he's uncomfortable about a specific subsection. And then in the communication to council, that can be made clear that Commissioner Brodsky was uncomfortable with subsection, the tree exceptions. And
Well, we don't have to name names.
No, I mean,
Does that accurately portray your
like I said, I just
concern?
want to, I was just looking what the process is, because I think there's gonna be other areas in here that the same thing's gonna come up. I can't imagine that a rewrite of the code is gonna be unanimous by every single planning
Right.
director on every single issue.
Exactly.
And as you point out, that may or may not affect planning commissioners' votes on to recommend or not recommend the entire package. You will have a final option to take a position on the package.
Exactly.
But I just wanted to understand the implication when it got to the council, how they understood how they read what we were doing. And I get it, that it makes sense now. But I just want to be sure we were on the same page about what they're going to hear and then what they're going to do when they hear that.
Commissioner Fragola, did you have something to say? Okay. And I'm going to, we haven't, so let's take a vote. All those in favor of, do you want me to do the entire section, the transition section?
What happened to the intrusions thing? Were we going to get more information about point B and the intrusions and why it wasn't considered?
Yeah, to see if we want
Yeah.
to, it's a good point.
Sorry.
So let's, we have 2 minutes to 7:30. I just want to check in with staff. How do you propose?
We also have some renumbering to do a little bit.
Something we could straw poll.
Hang on. I'm sorry. I haven't done a good job of kind of maintaining side talks and just, let's keep this tight because I've kind of allowed it, just people popping in, but let's keep it a little tighter. So staff, we've got 2 minutes. What do you want to do? We have one more meeting. Do you want me to, Commissioner Ramey, can you do me a favor? Yeah, great, thanks. How do you want to do this? Because I don't know if we ask if there's an extension, we stay another 15 minutes tonight or 10 minutes, or we just move it to the next meeting.
If I may just jump in here briefly. So we only have one more meeting scheduled for this, where we'd hope to get through the trees. That's going to be a pretty big topic. And there's just a clustering of meetings coming up because of the downtown riverfront, because of this topic. So this is a 5:30 meeting, so you do have the ability, maybe more easily than in the middle of the day, to go longer if you wanted to. The next meeting is also a 5:30 meeting, so that's an option for you as well. You can't stay later. Okay, good to know.
On the next meetings.
Okay, good to know. So that's some information. The other option is if we didn't get through it all, we could poll for an additional meeting and try to squeeze it in. Maybe it's like something on the 29th, but I know we're already asking a lot of you guys, so I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, and once again, if we can just not have side conversations, insert, raise your hand, let's keep it a little bit more organized. So a few votes, one vote. Who is open to staying tonight for an additional, why don't I say half an hour? Who's open? Available? Staff? Okay, so we've got a half an hour tonight. Do we want to see how far we can go? And at the end of that, we can see if an additional meeting is needed. We can maybe create a temporary meeting in case the second one doesn't work out, so we can be polled or whatever needs to happen proactively. How's that sound? Okay, so thank you, Commissioner Ramey. That is a very good point. Thanks for bringing the intrusions. That was a suggested piece, is allowed intrusions. Do we want to, it's kind of hard because we need the existing code to see how it compares. This could be, yes. Commissioner, wait a minute. That was really a question for staff. If you have a suggestion about how to look at the intrusions. One of the suggestions is, Commissioner Randall, I'll just go ahead.
Yeah, I think this might clarify. I mean, it looks like Alyssa has the code there, so I'm wondering if she could just read us 67453 so that we know what's in that compared to what's here.
And that's exactly what I was trying to say.
So this is an abbreviated version of that.
Abbreviated, and so this, if you want me to do that, I can, if that's what folks would like.
If it would be great, actually, I think what Janessa is doing is actually going to be a little bit more helpful, is if you can roll to the section, have us look at it, and you have what's being proposed in front of you, obviously. And why she's doing that, Commissioner Fragola and then Commissioner Borowski.
If I do this, though, it'll.
So I was wondering if it was a possibility. It seemed like there were several little pieces in transition standards for housing clear and objective applications. If we didn't take a straw poll on this tonight and let a little bit of it come back to the Tuesday meeting, we could take the rest of the time that we have tonight to actually work through some of these things. But if the intrusions are the only thing and we just need to look at that, then let's look at that right now.
So it's a good question. There's a lot of quicker pieces to get through. Staff, what is your preference?
I guess I'm trying to understand the direction that that you're wanting to have consider this, because it would allow more intrusions, and that's the direction you want to go. That generally Planning Commission wants to increase the amount of allowed intrusions, or whether there's like what are we gaining?
So hang on, there's a few things that are we're talking about right now. It was Commissioner Ramey brought it up. There's a curiosity. I'm not sure there's a direction. There hasn't been general direction from Planning Commission. Curiosity was a question. Okay. The other thing is Commissioner Fragola's actually her suggestion might be a good one. We've got 25 minutes. There's a substantial kind of questions around this. We can get, maybe there's some clear direction we can give back to staff, and we actually address this at the next meeting. So I'm open to what you guys think. And I think we've spent, actually, I've been watching it, like 15 minutes just on the discussion of process, which I'm not sure is super effective. So let's just make a decision and move wherever way we decide to go.
I think I'd like direction on what to come back with, and then I can try to, in a nutshell, that I just want to know what problem we're solving with the intrusions.
Great. I think that sounds reasonable. So if everybody's okay, let's do what Commissioner Fragola has suggested. Let's give feedback to staff as to what we want. Or anything else on this section, so they can come back. We can clearly have a kind of defined discussion to make our final straw poll vote at the next meeting. Commissioner Randall.
I think the question that I heard from Commissioner Ramey was just, what is 9674553 compared to this? And I think that would clarify that pretty easily as far as why this one is here and not just referencing that section. And I think just looking at that, because I know that section, and I think clarify it pretty easily and pretty quickly.
Let's make sure, because I'd love for for Commissioner Ramey, for you to speak on behalf of yourself, since you brought it up. Yeah.
Oh, I was just so much enjoying, because you're right. I mean, that was the
Yeah.
curiosity about why do we already have a section that deals with protrusions? Let's just use that one. And then, and secondarily, why even reference it then? Let's not even, let's just say these are our protrusion standards for this special transition period. We're done.
I will say one thing, in how much this has demonstrated how much we are critiquing clear and objective nature of the code sections in front of you. To reference this section, it is quite extensive. It's supposed to be clear and objective, and without having reviewed it, I'm just a little concerned that pointing back at this versus the subset that we have may have some unintended consequences that I'm not sure if we can vet those in a week.
Okay.
So that would mean,
Commissioner Fregla?
so that would mean not referring to it
Correct.
and just going with what is stated here.
Okay, so I'm going to put myself in the queue. I'm going to restate
do it.
this. This is important, what we're doing. And I know that we have a timeline. There have been so many questions on this section that and personally, I am going to abstain. I think I want an understanding of why decisions are made. I don't like arbitrary 25 feet here, 15 feet here, and where's the and what standards, what other standards are happening. I know you can't look at everything, yet if I were council, I'd want that. If I had the public, I want that. This is granted, and we are going to get more feedback, I'm hoping, in this process. Obviously, this is the preliminary stage before the hearing. I would like to be thoughtful. Here's our chance to be thoughtful about it. If there's already a code section that actually meets it, why are we going to repeat it? I don't want to just make the assumption, well, it kind of looks right now like it might not that I'm saying that's what you're saying. I think thoughtful level of intention of looking at it. That's why we're here as an at-large committee to provide this role. I feel uncomfortable at the for this section. It's important. There are 4 options. This is clear and objective. If sitting in front of someone, I want to meet what the goals are that we're trying to achieve. So I wanted to tell you, as I was silent, I am going to abstain. So, and I want more information. And I'm fine abstaining also and having people move forward and vote. And it's just because I have too many questions. So Commissioner Fragola.
So then I guess I would go back again to the recommendation that I made, that staff be given some more time to work on this before our next meeting, and that we take the remaining 20 minutes that we have to look at some of the other things that are in front of us.
So, okay, I agree. So if it sounds like Commissioner Ramey, I do like this idea. If just to look at it, see does it meet clear and objective? If it doesn't, obviously, that's not going to get us where we need to go. If it does, if it's complicated, doesn't matter. So we're going to create a whole different section that's equally as complicated potentially, or maybe it's clear. Anyways, just have a discussion about it. Pro, con, what do we have? Does it work? And the other thing is I've already discussed kind of where I want to know why certain decisions are being made. 25-foot distances between trees versus 15-foot. I want to make sure, have we thought about this? What are the implications? And I would like to actually have more feedback. I'm going to see if there are other people that we can grab feedback that are users of code prior to our next meeting. I think it would be helpful. Yeah, because I know you're in a pickle, staff, because you've received very, very little testimony. Okay, anything else that you want staff to follow up on? Commissioner Borowski.
I was just going to say what Commissioner Fragel, I agree with that. I agree with you looking at the standard. The standard, in my limited use or references to it, a lot of it has to do with front yard intrusions and stuff like that. So there may be transitional things that we don't want to have that, and then the other thing is by doing this, it gives the public more options to weigh in as well. If they see something in there, they've got a week to weigh in on this if somebody's watching this. So I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Okay. So there any other follow-up items we want from staff on these sections? Okay, great. I think overall it makes sense. Just what we're hearing is let's look at the intrusions. Let's look at, making sure other sections, do we have an understanding of why we're making choices? Come back with an explanation of why we're making certain choices. Is it what we want? Does it make sense? Rather than just numbers. And I know that's not the case, and I don't mean to, it's just, yes, that's it.
Well, I agree. But just remember, numbers sometimes are a starting place, and this is the time to.
That's exactly right. And here, I don't know us just throwing a number out without an understanding of what the impact to trees are, other code sections, and we asked you, and there didn't seem like there was clear enough information. So if we can provide that, that'd be great.
Sure.
Yep. Perfect. Okay.
Okay, so we're going to leave transition standards and
Move to
geotech.
Great.
And so the geotechnical recommendation was to revise the existing requirements to basically include some additional risk factors. I'm going to go back over to the code. So one of the things that we did here, we specified the types of design professionals. We added an Oregon licensed geotechnical engineer based on feedback. There was comment about the prepared within 5 years of the date of application. That is something that Public Works staff supports, having that 5-year kind of requirement, because things do change and licenses expire, and while some of the soil conditions may stay the same, there could be some changes that 5 years seemed like a reasonable amount of time. The subsection A that's added here, if you recall, one of the things early on, we were in the midst of the Department of Gravel and Mineral Industries, DGAMI, was in the process of creating some new landslide hazard maps that in front of you on each end of the table, there's a sample map here. They went through an extensive process that involved FEMA and looking at our entire area, of Eugene, Springfield, the regional area. And so one of the things that came out of that was a new interactive landslide hazard map. And in that map has historical landslide sites. It has areas of shallow landslide susceptibility and areas of deep landslide susceptibility. The factors that we get at, the risk factors that are more site-specific, really get at kind of the shallow hazard risks. The thing that we didn't have in our existing code was getting at the deep landslide susceptibility areas. So there's some difficulty. We explored, should we adopt the DGAMI maps outright, and kind of explored a couple different options, but there were some challenges with it. And these are kind of a new thing, so there aren't a lot of communities in Oregon that have already gone through adopting the DGAMI site maps. So one of the alternatives that we looked at was adopting just our own special layer that's only the deep hazard. So it's only addressing the portion of of those new maps that we don't really have another way to get at that risk factor. And so what we would propose is doing similar to what we did with the UGB adoption. It would be to digitally adopt a version of this deep landslide hazard map with the current layer of the tax map boundaries. And so that's what subsection A basically refers to, and this is just a draft to give you an idea of what that looks like in the portion of within the UGB that's affected. We could have it trimmed so that it's only in showing that within the UGB. This map is not set in yet, but that's just illustrative for you. So subsection B clarifies, it adds the 20% slopes or greater being an additional risk factor to look at. This is, again, one of those ones where it's hand in hand with, we're eliminating the prohibition on 20% slopes. This is just tying it in so that the geologist or geotechnical engineer considers the 20% slopes as a risk. Makes it clear, basically, that those are included. It also added soil types, open drainage ways, and fill. Those were other things that came up through the working groups and earlier work in the process. And then we just kind of clarified some language and tried to make it clear what that certification from the professional would need to address. And again, this was tying in a little bit with some of the safety hazards where we're looking at where the proposed lot layout and road locations are in consideration of the potential risks. Any specific questions? Is that enough of an overview on this section, or?
Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, I've got a couple of specific questions. So if in section, the first section, section 6, the report is prepared within 5 years of the date of the application. So, but we've got newer landslide policies. Can they go back and use the 5-year-old? If I do a geotech today, and this is applied now, is my geotech that's today good for 5 years? That's one question. Second question is, what kind of process is the DEGAMI approval? Is that a council approval? Is that a city manager's administrative rule approval to get that in? Because that is a significant change to what can and cannot be built by adopting that map.
So to answer your first question, the report has to include, among other things, identification of any portion of the proposed development site that's located in an area of moderate or high landslide susceptibility as shown on the adopted map. So if you had an old report that predated the adopted map, it would need to be updated to identify the property as shown on the map. So you can't get around the map. To your second question.
So what is the 5 years then for? Why would you say it?
Well, I think going forward.
In the future.
Right. So we'll adopt the map at a point in time. An application comes in 7 years from now that the report was 2 years old after we adopted the map, that would still fall within that 5-year window.
So is there an adopted map now?
No.
There is no adopted map now.
No. So then the other piece of the puzzle is that we would be asking, as part of this code adoption process, the council to adopt, this is a draft, but the final version of this map. It will be static unless and until the council readopts a new map. So.
Okay, so the question is, so that adopting that map is part of this code amendment process?
Yes.
I don't know if that's been made clear to the public, because it's a significant change that's a significant change to the code. And I don't know if the builders know that. I don't know if people have read and realized that that is part of this code amendment.
This identifies a risk zone that's been for years. I mean, there's been versions of this that Dagami has had. They've referred to it as Slido, the Oregon slide and landslide, So this is a more accurate version because it was based on LiDAR, and I don't remember what that acronym starts for. It's laser, or light. So what this map is just identifying a risk that needs to be just addressed as part of the geotechnical thing. It's not saying any land is unbuildable. It's just saying that if you're building in an area where there's landslide hazard, then your geotechnical report needs to address that and provide recommendations on how to safely build on it, provide recommendations on how that impacts the road layout or lot locations, and they may indicate or recommend like particular lots that should have a geotechnical report for the specific buildings when they come in down the road. So it's not, I guess I'm trying to understand what.
That's why I asked, is there an approved map now of landslide that if the Dagami wasn't in there and is not adopted because it's brand new technology, would they still have to do prepare a report looking at the susceptibility?
Mm-hmm.
And what would
I would say that, and this we did hear from at least one of the design professionals, one of the geotechnical engineers early on, is that part of their, doing a geotechnical report, they, as a licensed professional responsible for what they're certifying, they use Slido maps and whatnot. This is just an added requirement to ensure that that is being checked, that risk information is being considered.
So Commissioner Borofsky, what I'm hearing, you might have additional questions, but I think what might be helpful bringing it to council is to actually make that clear that actually this map doesn't exist and it is part of the adoption process, just that it's not noted, that there is this additional thing happening over here that actually is going to be used to interpret this code section. Commissioner, I can't remember who went first. Do you guys care? Commissioner Fragola and then Commissioner Edwards.
I just have a clarifying question about the map. What are we using now? Slido? It's a fun name. So we have a map that we're using now, correct? And so we don't have a map that we're using now.
We don't have an adopted map.
We don't have an adopted map that we're
So
using now.
the city has not adopted its own map that we're asking people to look at. However, my understanding is, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, that as part of the professional due diligence that goes along with certifying a geotechnical report, a responsible geotechnical professional would be looking at things like Slido now, the Dagami map. The proposed code section will ensure that that is happening. But it will be a static version of the map as applied to the city of Eugene and our particular tax lots. And part of the reason for that is because, again, we are in the clear and objective universe. And so, Dagami helpfully, for a professional, made their maps where, you can zoom in and you can zoom out, and it's a little bit unclear about where on the tax lot a slide area is. It can move as you zoom around, and that's probably helpful in their world, but it's not particularly clear and objective if the lines can move. And so what the solution that we came up with was that the city adopt a static map for our area so the lines don't change. And that way, it is clear to everyone what we're looking at, and there is a requirement that it be looked at as part of the geotech report.
So it's in an effort to get to a clear and objective standard.
We couldn't refer to, so there's an interactive map online, and we could not just refer to that map because it could change, and it wasn't 100%, it wasn't tax lot specific. So.
Commissioner Edwards and then Commissioner Randall.
I think you kind of answered my question, Alyssa, meaning that if this is the official adopted map, then this is actually what the professionals would be then required to consider. And the most recent version available of it would always be the version that would be considered. Does that make sense? Or no?
No. So,
So you'd have to adopt a new one every time it changes? Could you write it so that you could say that just?
Before we go down that rabbit
Okay.
hole, I just want to point out that this is the deep landslide susceptibility. Think deep time. This is the layer that is looking at subsurface massive historic landslides in this area in geologic time. This is not something that if there's a slide because of the storm that we just had you need to update this one.
Right.
That's not the case. We stayed away from that, and with the shallow susceptibility maps, there's some interpretation because they can actually pick up at the level of retaining walls, some of the vertical surfaces and stuff because slope is factored in there, and that's why we opted to stay with these more clear and objective and manageable risk factors for the shallow aspect, but the deep slide, this is not likely to change. So.
Okay, that does answer my question.
Commissioner Randall.
And I guess too, isn't this also somewhat in response to some of the dueling experts that we've had in the past where you have one geotech saying one thing and another geotech saying another, and they're both testifying at a public hearing, and we are not geotechs. And so getting to a clear and objective standard, if you have to use this, it's again, the prescriptive standard. If you think clear and objective as prescriptive rather than performance-based, then, and I think that way in my architecture practice, but this addresses the clear and objective prescriptive standard so that if you go down this track, you basically, I would think we couldn't have dueling experts because they're using the same map, unless there's a way to interpret it differently. But I guess it tightens up that concern that we've had with dueling experts.
The map would address the risk factor. The dueling experts can still disagree about what you do with that. Yeah.
It sounds like it's getting better in that regard.
So I'll put myself in the queue is that it sounds like staff, you've had a geotech, because I'm not a geotech engineer, so you've had a professional look at this for languaging, clear and objective, because if not, I would recommend it, because I have like area of moderate or high landslide, susceptibility, you're calling it deep slide. Are those terms, is it clear what that means?
It is, and that this would be
Right,
what was
right.
adopted. So,
Okay.
so we didn't have to, if we were distinguishing and using the Dagami maps,
You'd
we
have
would
to
have to
change
say
it.
the deep landslide.
Okay.
But because it's this map, we don't
Okay.
have to confuse things with that.
Okay, so let me just continue, is that there's other, and once again, this could be very simple, is like suitability under subsection C1. Is suitability understood? I mean,
Well-
so there's some words that, is that clear as to what it is?
And this is one that's similar to what we have now, and the professional is determining the suitability based on their expertise. Staff is not using discretion to determine what suitability is.
Okay, and
That
you
makes
guys,
sense.
of course, I see what's happening here, and as long as that fits within kind of the approach of the clear and objective standards, because there's obviously some subjectivity within here, yet you're asking the professional to provide their
yes.
opinion.
I think it's much like the geotech requirement now, or exactly
Yes.
like the geotech requirement now. There is discretion involved in the professional's opinion, but it belongs to the geotechnical professional.
Okay.
What city staff is looking for in the clear and objective piece is, did we get the letter or the study, and does the study check these boxes? Does somewhere it say, I have reviewed the suitability for blah, blah, blah?
Okay.
And as long as they can check those boxes, then they'll meet the criterion.
Okay, I'm gonna, sorry, 2 more words. In subsection B, impacted, will not be impacted by existing or potential stability problems, or the following is really clear. Impacted by existing and potential stability problems. Just want to make sure, have you guys reviewed that? I read that. That to me has a level of subjectivity. It's like, well, what exactly does that mean? Impacted by what?
I would kind of go back to the same answer. That
Okay.
is something that it's not us determining whether it's impacted. That's
Okay.
the design professional, and that's existing language that we're not tinkering, that we weren't planning to tinker with here. It hasn't been a problem in the past.
Okay, great. So the other two, 3, subsection C3, did you mean that to be B and C or A and B? Because B and C brings you looping back to exactly where the subsection 3 is. I just wasn't sure, because C is actually what we're under right now.
Oh, I bet it was A and B.
Okay.
There were some
Totally, I get
structural
it.
changes,
I
so I
just
think
was
you caught
wondering,
one where
'cause I
it probably
looped
should be
and-
A and B.
Yeah, and then 4 and 5, just for the public, I think I get it, but why are those separate? Just so that people understand why 4 and 5 are actually separate. One's development site, one's proposed lots and parcels.
The lots and parcels gets more at the subdivisions or planned unit developments where you're really preliminary and you don't have designs. And so it was because this applies at different levels and different types.
Perfect.
Trying
So
to be
I got
clear.
that question in my, great, that's all I have, Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, and this makes it a little bit clearer. You know, you're talking about the deep ones. But when a PUD is going to be proposed and a neighborhood association looks at this section and sees it as slides and suitability of these types of terms, they're going to think higher level slides. So I think it needs to be very clear that these are, one, that these are what this actually is, that these are millennial type slides. And 2, if it's a millennial slide or triggered by an earthquake or something like that, are we worrying about this? If it's that type of a deep thing slide, are there things that can be done to mitigate those? I mean, is it even possible? If we're talking about half a hill going down and you're asking a geologist to say this street will be safe if half this hill goes away, how can he do that? Because if you're talking deep down, big time, half a hill, like Washington, where they lost all those people, those types of slides, I think is what this is referring to. How could you ask a geologist to sign off that it's going to be safe to build in that section?
So the fact that there was a previous deep landslide in the location, when Dagami presented the maps and described the process that they went through, one of the things that came up was that one of the biggest indicators of a future slide is being on top of a past slide. And so that's why this is an important risk factor. It's not, it's not a 100% guarantee, I think, when a professional, there's got to be some bar. It's kind of like we regulate to the 100-year flood event. That doesn't mean you're not going to see a 1,000-year flood in the community. There's a point where there's an optimization of risk versus, worth building somewhere and mitigating within reason. And so I would have to talk to some of the design professionals to understand that bar a little bit better, but that's what I assume is that they definitely have mitigation options that they can recommend for safely building in areas of risk.
Okay, so if you look at section C here, it says, if a proposed development will be located in an area identified as moderately highly susceptible to landslides pursuant to A, which is
Orange
referring
and
to that
red.
map. But when I'm a neighbor trying to oppose a PUD, I read that as susceptible to landslides, not, and so if we can make that clearer so that they don't spend a lot of money on an appeal, which is gonna cost people both ways, just so that we can make that as clear as possible.
It says pursuant to A,
Yeah.
and then that takes you right back to the map, so I don't know how you could make it any clearer.
I just know that I've been in those neighborhood meetings. And so that's what, I mean, clarity.
So, time check, I allowed it to go 6 minutes over. I was hoping we would kind of come to closure with this one, but, so we're 6 minutes over. I want to honor that we said 8 o'clock. Do you want to give a few minutes, see if we can provide closure for geotech? Can people be here? I want to respect, I'm seeing nods. Okay. Okay, so thank you for, sorry I interrupted. Sounds like Commissioner Randall gave a response to Commissioner Borowski. Does anybody have any other comments in this particular section? Okay, so I'm going to suggest we, similar to how Lauren described the last one, unless Lauren, staff has any particular, let's just get a vote in terms of your perspective of clarity. Let me start there, just so we can, do others think that more clarity in order to respond to Commissioner Borowski is needed in that first sub 6A? So, I mean, on a show of hand, do people think there needs to be clarity in 6A? And it's per Commissioner Borowski's concern about neighbor interpretation, that the area of moderate high landslide susceptibility, that just by saying as shown on the adopted map isn't clear enough.
I think clarity that council knows that if they adopt this, they're adopting a new map would be very important to me.
Yes, okay. So are you then saying we don't need are you not suggesting additional clarity in the language? Okay. Okay, Commissioner Fragola, did you have a comment? No? Okay, so I'm going to start here. Obviously, we have this map question. Staff already knows. We're going to make sure there's a note that this, perfect, you've got the note. All those that support, there are a few changes that were made. If you can bring up, just peruse it. I'm not going to repeat it, but it's the red sections that are different. Scroll down a bit. There's just the A and B. All those in favor of supporting as proposed? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're 10 minutes over. Thank you for your patience. Are there any, before we close, staff, Planning Commission, do you have any final comments? I think we need to brainstorm for next meeting. Like I said, maybe a poll to see if there's a third meeting. So
Yeah,
talk about that a little bit.
I was just going to say that we are going to poll you guys, apologize in advance, probably April 29th or
During that week.
30th, during that week sometime.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that can be just kind of, we can hold it as temporary, obviously, if we're able to successfully move
Exactly.
through things.
If you make it through, awesome, but this is just in case we don't. And I would move one of these other meetings, but one of them, we have people coming in from out of state that kind of have to be here on that date, and then the other one also, they all have these deadlines that we can't avoid. Yep.
Do we have a meeting on Monday on the 22nd?
Yes.
Yes, we do, yes.
And Commissioner Edwards, you had a question? Did you have a question? Okay, sorry. Okay. Commissioner Brodsky?
So can you just run through I don't have the schedule in front of us. So what is our schedule and the topics?
Yeah, so today, of course, is the 16th. The next one is on the 22nd. The topic is the land use code audit. And I think you've already had one meeting on that topic. And that's, sorry? That's also timely. And the second half of that is the downtown riverfront adoption package, which is, yeah, it's huge, another big one.
So just to clarify, on the 22nd, you'll be given an overview of the package by staff. You're not.
Not diving
It's
into
just
it
a very
yet.
high level, kind of what are the various pieces of the package?
Yep.
Yeah,
The why.
How many
Why and
meetings
how?
do we have on that?
many, I'm not sure
Okay.
exactly.
Multiple deliberations after the hearing.
So that's not even the hearing. The 22nd is just an overview from staff. Then separately, you'll have a public hearing, and then you have multiple meetings scheduled for deliberations on the package.
Correct. Thank you. And the following day on the 23rd is the second work session for the clear and objective update. And then the next meeting after that is May 7th. The council meeting for clear and objective is on May 20th. And there's a requirement that we have our information into council actually 2 weeks prior to their meeting. So that has constrained for us some of the flexibility in working up to the last minute. So, yep.
Okay, great. So watch Commissioner Fragola.
So you're suggesting the 29th?
Sometime during that week, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
sometime
we would
during that
try
week.
for the Monday or Tuesday, but I think in this case, we'll probably send out a poll that has some other dates and times that week as well.
Perfect. So watch for the poll, watch for your email. Thank you for staying late and for your contributions. And is there any other comments from staff? Okay, any last comments from Planning Commission? Okay, we're adjourned meeting tonight. Thank you.